Being an informed citizen is not always easy. You want to know what's going on, to stay up to date with the big news stories that affect your fellow humans across the planet. But the non-stop deluge of important events makes it difficult to completely understand the headlines. And that's where we hope the explanation from the BBC World Service can help. I'm Anu Anand. I'm going to ask some of my BBC colleagues to help me break down big global stories, using archive recordings made on the ground to make sense of why these stories are important.
There were always fears that Friday prayers here would end in bloodshed.
Today, we delve into relations between Israelis and Palestinians with the BBC's Jeremy Bowen. This is The Explanation from the BBC World Service.
One of the reasons I think why people become journalists and foreign correspondents is that you feel that you get a chance to see history unfolding.
This has been a day for burying the dead and worrying where and when the next bomb will come.
Sometimes it's not good history.
The bomb exploded on the same street, on the same bus route, at almost the same time as last week.
But you feel almost like you're in the cockpit of the world.
Sadly, not a year goes by without clashes between Israel and the Palestinians making news. At its heart, the conflict is about land and who has rights to it. Over the next 15 minutes, we'll hear what forces have shaped this fight and why peace feels so elusive. Jeremy Bowen has been covering the Middle East for the BBC since the 1990s.
If you can hear me and I can hear you, I think we're good to
Let's go. When he first moved there in 1995, he rented a house in the village of Ain Karem, from where Palestinians had been displaced decades earlier.
In the garden, there was a big prickly pear, big cactuses. They were used traditionally by Palestinian farmers as fences. They're covered in nasty prickles, but they produce a fruit. Now, one morning I saw an elderly lady wearing an embroidered Palestinian dress at the bottom of the garden gathering the prickly pear. Essentially what she said was that she'd always come to gather prickly pears in the village because she was from the village. And I think she also felt that the fruit was theirs.
His story really stays with me because it illustrates the emotional connection that people have to their land, generation after generation. Now, in my research, I discovered that as far back as 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte had offered Palestine as a homeland for the Jewish people. But the story of the tussle between Jews and Palestinians begins in earnest in 1897.
In 1897, there was an event called the World Zionist Congress, and it was organized by a Jewish writer, Theodor Herzl. And what happened at that event, in his words, was that he invented the Jewish state.
Now, a Zionist is someone who supports the creation of a Jewish nation in Palestine. The word comes from one of the hills of ancient Jerusalem called Zion. Herzl and the Congress invited more than 200 delegates to Basel, Switzerland, and held a symbolic parliament, a chance for Jews to express their determination for nationhood.
After the conference, some European rabbis went to Palestine, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire, to see the territory which at that time was still being debated, but was a potential site for a Jewish state. And they sent back a telegram and they said, the bride is beautiful, but she's married to somebody else. In other words, the land is great, but hang on, there are people here.
So, Jeremy, what is the key event in 1917 that brings the British into this whole conflict?
In 1917, British Empire forces, led by General Allenby, captured Jerusalem. They captured Palestine. And he entered the old city. Back in the UK, in London, notable British Jews had been pressuring the British government to declare that it would be a site for a future Jewish state. They issued a statement which became known as the Balfour Declaration, where they declared that the British authorities would look with favour on establishing a homeland for Jews in that territory. Now, within that, there was a built-in contradiction because it said it was without prejudice to the rights of peoples already living there. They didn't say Arabs or Palestinians or anything like that. As things turned out, you couldn't really have one without the other happening.
The World Zionist Congress and the Balfour Declaration sparked a movement. In the 1930s and 40s, Zionists began moving to Palestine.
The seas are now open to the seekers of the Promised Land. The refugees from memories of war-scarred Europe land in a country already in the grip of bitter racial strife.
From early on, conflicts between the two communities turned violent, and some of those are still historically controversial, and both sides blame each other as they have done, consistently for a century or more. In the 1930s, there was a full-on Arab uprising. The British responded to that with all the tools that they used in colonial imperial rule, with legal executions, summary executions, and, a fierce use of force.
Towards the end of World War II, the Nazi Holocaust shocked the world. An estimated 6 million Jews were systematically murdered by Adolf Hitler's regime across Europe, greatly increasing support for Jewish refugees. Even so, their influx into Palestine began to cause a new conflict.
With the refugee problem of Hitler's Europe still an unhappy and recent memory, another of the same kind has been building up in Palestine, where nearly 1 million harmless Arab villagers have been made homeless as a result of war in the Holy Land.
In 1947, Britain took the problem to the United Nations, which came up with a two-state solution, with land for Israelis and land for Palestinians, and a shared capital in Jerusalem run by the international community. But the plan was rejected by Arab leaders. In 1948, Britain withdrew.
David Ben-Gurion, the first founding Prime Minister of Israel and the leader of the Zionist movement at that time, declared Israel's independence in Tel Aviv in 1948.
על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
Within hours of declaring its independence, Israel was at war.
The battle started in earnest, with Bren guns, Tommy guns and rifles. We climbed onto the roof of our hotel. The Jerusalem sky was alive with the glow of tracer bullets as they sped across from one suburb to another.
It was a tough fight for the Israeli side, and there were times when they might have lost, but they were absolutely determined. And of course, in the years after the Holocaust, there were people fighting there who'd come in from Europe as well as native-born. In the end, it was a comprehensive victory for the Israeli side, and a defeat that sent the Arab world into a tailspin for decades.
The new state of Israel had not only expelled invading Arab countries, it had captured much more territory than was mandated by the UN plan.
For Palestinians, it was, well, they call it the catastrophe, the Nakba. Estimates vary. Some of the most reliable are around 750,000 Palestinians were forced out of their homes. For Palestinians, the events of 1948 destroyed their society. This was not some kind of a desert that the Israelis made bloom. It was the fertile coastal strip. It was a place where people lived.
That was only the start. The Six-Day War in 1967 saw Israel take even more territory, while in the coming decades, Jewish settlers began moving into Palestinian neighborhoods, bringing with them armed Israeli soldiers, checkpoints, and further conflict.
What the settlements have done, and they started almost immediately after that 1967 victory, is to establish Jews in strategic parts of the occupied territories. The idea was, right from the outset, the settlement movement would say that it is our duty to people the land with Jews. This is Jewish land. Historically, biblically, it's Jewish land, and we need to take it back. And that will be the beginning of righting a great historical wrong.
These highly emotive, deadly clashes involving religion, land, and history have endured and evolved over decades. the Palestinian Liberation Organization formed in the 1960s to resist Israel. In 1987, Hamas, an extremist Sunni Islamist group, vowed to fight for Israel's very destruction. That same year, Palestinians launched the first Intifada, or shaking off, an uprising against Israeli occupation that led to 6 years of protests, violent riots, and street battles. Then, in 1993, after 45 years of deadly conflict, a moment of peace.
لأن أرض السلام تتوق للسلام العادل والشامل.
Ladies and gentlemen, the battle for peace is the most difficult battle of our lives. The land of peace yearns for a just and comprehensive peace. Thank you.
Israelis and Palestinians signed the Oslo Peace Accords. The PLO's Yasser Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook hands for the first time ever at the White House, while President Bill Clinton looked on.
It represented a real moment of hope.
Mr. President, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Because if you look at the sorry history of the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, between Arabs and Jews, there weren't many moments of hope. There was a feeling that something was going to come out of it. The principle behind the Oslo agreements was that they would deal with the small stuff first and create a positive mood, which meant they could deal with the really big stuff later on, which, included where exactly would the borders go, the future of Jerusalem, whose capital city would it be, and what about Palestinian refugees? What rights would they have?
But they never got to the really big stuff.
Around mid-morning, Yitzhak Rabin's coffin was loaded onto an army truck for his last journey to Jerusalem. This country is in deep shock.
The assassination of Rabin on November the 4th, 1995, I think it was one of the most effective political assassinations of the 20th century.
Yitzhak Rabin had been shot dead at a peace rally by an ultranationalist Israeli radically opposed to the Oslo Accords.
After the shooting last night, his supporters could hardly bear to move, let alone go home to face the future. The news that Yitzhak Rabin had died was relayed to the crowd outside the hospital where he'd been taken.
After that, the difficult steps couldn't be taken. Hamas and the others reacted violently. They set out to try to destroy it by killing Israelis, bus bombs, killing civilians, children, women, men, in the hope that that would destroy any chance of peace.
Israel says Palestinian officials are controlling the level of violence on the streets. Palestinians believe Israel has provoked trouble so it can escape the commitments it made in peace talks.
It wasn't certain that Oslo was going to work, but I think that had Rabin not been assassinated and had he been able to continue working with Arafat, then they had a chance.
For the next 10 years, from 1995 to 2005, more violence prevailed. A never-ending battle for territory, including the Second Intifada, which lasted for 5 years. This time, Hamas took power in Gaza, splitting the Palestinian population politically. The chance of a peace deal with equal territory for both sides and a shared capital in Jerusalem, as envisioned by the UN in 1947, became a distant dream. Today, the really big stuff, as Jeremy calls it, remains unsolved. Jeremy, why is Jerusalem so emotionally relevant, even today, to both Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, it starts with religion because Jerusalem is a place which has the holiest sites for Christians and for Jews and the third holiest place in the world for Muslims. So it's immensely religiously significant. And it's also a national symbol for both Israelis and Palestinians. And it's always been, through its history, violently contested.
Palestinians say Israel is desecrating the mosque and extending its control of the city, which Palestinians regard as their capital.
I think the uniqueness of the city is the fact that the three big world religions, they dream about the same small area. And the power of the city as a symbol comes from this high voltage fervour which is created by the fury of nationalists and also by religious passion. Jerusalem and its holy places are like a time bomb, really, in the middle of the Middle East.
So, Jeremy, today, after all these failed attempts at peace negotiations, is there still an appetite for peace?
You know, there's always an appetite for peace if you ask. People will always say, yeah, of course I want peace, for goodness sake. Are you mad? The difficulty is what kind of peace and how you get to the peace and whether or not it's possible to trust the other side with whom you're going to have to make agreements. You know, you make peace with your enemies, you don't make peace with your friends.
I very want to be optimistic about the ceasefire. I really hope that it will remain. The only thing that we want here is just to live our life without any alarms or any fire, just live in peace.
I don't believe in violence as a solution for anything, but I do think it's still a problem that there's a country so close to Israel who wants to get rid of it.
I'm against the ceasefire with Gaza. I think we should continue the fighting until Hamas will collapse totally.
So for the future, well, of course, you'll find many, many people who say, I want nothing more than peace. To try to get there means sorting out some of these incredibly difficult issues, which, you know, if it's going to be two states, would be, what about Jerusalem? What about Palestinian refugees? Where are you going to put the border? Could the Palestinians have an army? Could they defend themselves? Could the Israelis pursue people into their territory? Would they be properly sovereign? Loads of questions like that, which frankly defeated 20 years of negotiations or so. There are real divisions on both sides. Despite the fact they live in the same land under the same sun, they are two really different and separated communities who've become more separate.
Two communities, one land, no peace. That's Jeremy Bowen, the BBC's long-serving Middle East correspondent, on why peace remains so elusive. You've been listening to The Explanation with me, Anu Anand, on the BBC World Service. Stay up to date with the latest developments on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by visiting the BBC News website.
Thank you for listening. There will be more from the documentary podcast soon. The documentary is just one of our BBC World Service podcasts. There are many others to choose from.
It's really hard keeping up with the news.
This growing migrant crisis.
Military targets.
Political uncertainty.
Surging floodwaters. So, on the Global News Podcast, we'll tell you all the most important stories from across the world in the last 12 hours.
We start in China.
The European Union.
Here in South Africa.
Let's take you to space now.
We'll also explain why the stories matter and why we should care.
It's desperately cold here.
It certainly doesn't look good.
Think of it as your handy guide to becoming an expert in world affairs. We'll do the hard work, you just have to listen.
It's extremely important to get the two leaders together.
That's the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service.
A superheated stream of material, a bit like lightning.
Search for the Global News Podcast.